to patchy cloud but mostly fine. Hobart, we've got a partly cloudy Friday, partly cloudy Saturday, getting around about 14 degrees. Adelaide, well, we've got a mild and fine, mostly sunny day, should be looking to get one. Big patchy cloud, lots of sunshine tomorrow. Perth, partly cloudy today, getting up around about 21 degrees. Patchy cloud tomorrow, 22 much the same. And in Darwin, it's currently 32, that's our maximum. Fine and mostly sunny today, fine and mostly sunny Saturday. Right now it's 43, Eastern Standard Time, Central Australia 42, the Western Australia is 42.
ABC News Radio headlines.
The Prime Minister has dismissed Indonesia's criticism of Australia's response to the refugee crisis from Southeast Asia. The opposition leader Loch says that Clark and Georgeville should be able to return to Australia to assess the Royal Commission to Child Sexual Abuse. Mr. Shorten says the Catholic Church is going to change by how it responds to the private victims. Federal police are examining a camera mother's claim that her 13-year-old son's Facebook account's been hacked by ISIS recruiter, and the Townsville father of two's been sentenced to 7 years in jail for raping a 4-year-old girl lived in his apartment. The mining magnate Andrew Forrest has blamed lobbying by his company's bigger rivals for the federal government's decision to back away from the inquiry into iron ore pricing. A week ago, the Prime Minister Tony Abbott said he was open to an inquiry into whether BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto were manipulating prices by flooding the market. But federal cabinet was split. Last night, the government ruled out the inquiry altogether. However, for the Fortescue Metals Group chairman Andrew Forrest, the fines will be This time last week, a parliamentary inquiry into the role of Australia's two big miners in the collapse of the global iron ore price appeared to be almost a certainty. Last Friday, Tony Abbott told the Sydney broadcaster Alan Jones that he was open to the idea. What a difference a week makes.
We made a decision that there was no need for it at this time.
This morning in Tasmania, Tony Abbott was asked whether the government had caved into lobbying by miners.
Obviously, there were some very public calls for an inquiry about a week ago. We carefully thought it through. We talked to all the various players in the sector, and in the end came to the conclusion that a parliamentary inquiry would do more harm than good.
Two main voices have been making the call for an inquiry into the conduct of BHP and Rio Tinto. Fortescue Metals chairman Andrew Forrest and independent Senator Nick Xenophon. They say the miners are ramping up supply at the same time as demand from China is falling. The aim, they say, is to squeeze out smaller, higher-cost miners who can't turn a profit with iron ore prices where they are. Tony Abbott says the last thing he wants to see in the sector is predatory behaviour.
But we talked to the various people in the sector and came to the conclusion after the sort of consultation which sensible governments do that a parliamentary inquiry was going to generate more heat than light.
The opposition leader Bill Shorten says the matter has been a distraction.
Now we've seen the government carry on for a week about an phantom iron ore inquiry, jeopardising the position and reputation of Australian iron ore companies. But nowhere in this last week have I seen Tony Abbott or Del Hockey talk about the jobs of the actual miners who lost their jobs.
But Andrew Forrest thinks there's still hope for more scrutiny of his company's competitors. He's taking comfort in a line from a statement from the Treasurer Joe Hockey last night that there would be no inquiry at this time. He spoke to business editor Peter Ryan this morning.
I think that was an interesting choice of words that you didn't have to say. You cannot say that it's in the pockets of the multinational. He obviously found the pressure in his head from within his own cabinet, and I think those members of the cabinet who received the opportunity for transparency in this opaque industry just simply got it wrong. And I felt the Treasurer, I could imagine the immense pressure that he, the Prime Minister, were under, but I've seen it happen before, and Australia's got to ask, Peter, Australia's got to ask, do we want an environment where multinationals can change government policy at will to minimise tax, to change policy for their own
has driven the government's change of heart. Minerals Council CEO Brendan Pearson says the inquiry was never a certainty.
The investigation was based around the proposition that there might need to be policy intervention, which I don't think anyone's in favour of. Was always going to struggle.
Minerals Council Chief Executive Brendan Pearson ending at McGrath's report.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Well, a further 1,000 wind turbines will need to be built over the next 5 years if Australia is committed to revise renewable energy target of 33,000 kilowatt hours. Wind turbines have sparked controversy right across rural communities in Australia, but that's apparently in stark contrast to what is a stable and welcoming policy environment in Latin America. Former head of Hydro Pacific, Rob Grant, now heads up LATAM Investors, where he says is now attracting investment in Latin America's green power projects.
Well, during our time at Pacific Hydro, we were very proud to build a very successful business in Latin America, predominantly in Chile and in Brazil. During that time, we invested around $500 million of our shareholders' equity in new hydro and wind projects in Brazil and Chile. And that was really a consequence of the very strong and stable policy environment that those countries had for renewable energy. The strategic decision to move to Latin America from Australia was really based on the political and policy uncertainty we had here in Australia in the renewable energy sector. And the example how successful those markets have been in their renewable energy policy. When Brazil put their wind energy policy in place, they managed to roll out and deploy about twice as much wind capacity in 5 years as we did in 10 years.
They had not had the same concerns over so-called health issues of wind power. Is that what it is?
Look, generally Latin America has a far greater role for renewable energy than Australia, so countries like Brazil probably get about 85% of their energy from renewables already.
Particularly water.
Particularly water and large hydro. But the resource for wind and the opportunity there was ready and waiting.
But Australia has seen that policy flux. Now there is some agreement on renewable energy target, and it's a breakthrough. Will it deliver Australia's renewable energy independence?
To date it has been very successful, and it's only been the uncertainty about its future that's caused the investment drought to happen. Now that there is certainty, there is no problem for the industry to roll out a very substantial amount of new capacity. I think we'll need about probably 6,000 megawatts of new wind in the market as a consequence of the settlement of the RED filing, the renewable energy target filing. And I think between grid-connected wind and household-connected solar, we're going to see a very exciting next decade for renewable energy in Australia.
And that's Rob Grant, who's the head of LATAM Investors. He's the former corporate power company Pacific Hydro Australia, speaking with Cerebral. Now, coming up, we've got a news radio update with Kathy Bell just a matter of moments away. But first, look, for 5 decades, in fact, probably even longer, Joan Baez has been one of the most regular, recognisable names and voices of protest. It was during the 1960s she marched and sang alongside Martin Luther King right in Central Park. Years later, she was sounding the alarm gangs in Vietnam, particularly in the Pacific Street Festival. And even now, at the age of 74, she's still touring, still along the way. She's scooped gold albums, Grammys, and today the title Ambassador of Conscience. It's Amnesty International's top award, recognising, in Amnesty's own words, exceptional leadership in human rights and Australian work. Well, just after collecting the awards at the ceremony in Berlin, Joan Baez spoke about what her concerns are.
I think there's so many that it's difficult to find any direction to turn. I happen to be really lucky that I can sing, take myself with the songs, places, and I was explaining a while ago that what I do now hopefully is that it makes some differences. For instance, I'm going to Turkey at the beginning of the summer tour, and I've learned a song that's sung on the streets by the kids. It's also one that's specific to the women. But you know, if you say what is the most important cause, I mean, Loch is coming out, and the business of killing black people, black kids on the street, it may be the first time that most white Americans knew anything about it. So that's the only good thing that's come out of it. That maybe some people who are willing to have their eyes open, their eyes open.
And that was John Myers, Amnesty International's ambassador of conscience, which he was speaking to BBC's Tim Franks. Kathy Bell with you on ABC News Radio this afternoon, where Eastern Time is now 3 o'clock, 2:30 in the centre, in the west it's 1 o'clock. ABC News Radio. And making headlines this afternoon, the Immigration Minister Peter Dutton says the opposition leader is taking sides with the people smugglers in the debate over the refugee crisis in Southeast Asia. Bill Shorten is calling on the government to work with Myanmar to try and resolve humanitarian abuses causing people to flee the country. And he criticised the government, saying that the Prime Minister was dumbing down the issue and that Australia should be working with its neighbours to address the problem. Mr Dutton has hit back at the opposition leader.
The difficulty that we've got at the moment is that the government's message on boats has been undermined by Bill Shorten, because the people smugglers are hearing Mr Shorten equivocate, and he's dancing this funny dance, but he's not saying that he would adopt strong policies holding down the government, and that is undermining the government's success at the moment, to be honest. We are seeing people smugglers right now trying to fill boats in Southeast Asia. We've turned around boats where it's safe to do so, we'll continue to do so. The question is whether Mr Shorten has the metal to do, just as we are.
The Minister has also spoken about the government's refugee resettlement deal with Cambodia, saying he hopes more of those on Nauru will take up the offer. Cambodia has approved the transfer of all refugees from Australia to Phnom Penh under a $40 million deal with the country. The Catholic Church has decided it won't recall witnesses for cross-examination at the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse. Danny Tran reports from the hearings in the Victorian Regional City of Ballarat.
Yesterday, lawyers for the church have said they may have to rule witnesses about their claims after they previously decided not to. While as the Commission's chairman saying he will be seeking a statement from Cardinal George Pell on allegations that he tried to bribe a survivor to stay silent, something he's denied. Today, the church has said it won't be recalling anyone. A spokesman for the church's Truth, Justice and Healing Council says it is in the interest of anyone who witnesses to be questioned. The hearings will resume next week. Danny Tran, ABC News, Ballarat.
The Federal Treasurer Joe Hockey has defended the government's decision not to launch an inquiry into the iron ore industry. The government has been considering a probe into claims by Fortescue Metals Group that the big miners are deliberately driving down prices. Independent Senator Nick Xenophon says the decision not to go ahead with an inquiry shows the big mining companies are censoring the government. Mr Hockey says there's just no need for an inquiry at this time.
We have been saying all along that we would carefully consult with stakeholders. That's what I did. I only finished those consultations yesterday afternoon. There have been many moving parts, and there will continue to be many moving parts in the iron ore story.
The Prime Minister Tony Abbott says the federal government will develop a 15-year plan for infrastructure around the nation. Infrastructure Australia has released a report outlining the economic costs of road congestion. The report warns travel times on Australia's most gridlocked roads could double by 2031 unless there's more investment in transport projects. Mr Abbott says the nation's prosperity will be affected if there isn't more infrastructure development.
$63 billion a year congestion cost in just 15 years' time. That's more than $1 billion every single week.
Federal police are examining a Canberra mother's claim that her 13-year-old son's Facebook account was hacked by an Islamic State recruiter. president of the police in theory about why the 5 victims might have been killed. Court reporter Carl Herr.
The jury at Robert Z's trial has been shown a recorded police interview he did in July 2009, just days after the bodies of his brother-in-law Bin Lin and 4 others were found inside their North Epping home. Asked if he knew anything about why it might have happened, Z told detectives he couldn't figure out if he knew anything that was related to the case. He said he wasn't aware of Bin Lin owing money to anyone other than the bank, and he never mentioned anything about being threatened. His wife Kathy Lin didn't give evidence today because there was no interpreter available. She's scheduled to return to the witness box on Monday. Carl Herr, ABC News, Sydney.
A man will face court again in July, charged with the sexual and indecent assault of a woman in a wheelchair in Sydney's West. Mohammed Taha reports.
Police allege the woman was on a train from St Mary's in the early hours of the morning 2 weeks ago when 43-year-old Scott Tyndall approached her and pushed her wheelchair off the train when it stopped at Mount Druitt. Documents tendered to court allege Scott Tyndall then sexually and indecently assaulted the 57-year-old at a secluded area near the local library. He didn't appear in court today and has been remanded in custody until his next court appearance.
A sign installer has been found guilty for his role in the collapse of a brick wall in Melbourne that killed 3 people, including a brother and sister. The Melbourne Magistrates Court has found that subcontractor Jonathan Westmoreland could have ensured that a building permit was in place before erecting a sign on the brick wall of a construction site. The sign fell down in strong winds, taking the wall with it and killing 3 pedestrians in Swanston Street. The embattled air warfare destroyer project is again in troubled waters, with the federal government audit showing construction has grown out by $1.2 billion. As Angelique Donnellan reports, the total cost to build the 3 ships is expected to exceed $9 billion, with each ship more than 2 years behind schedule. The Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, says it will now look to another defence firm to help salvage the AWD project.
Private first, a managing contractor called Further and the ASD of capability.
Defence analyst Mark Thompson says the overrun puts further doubt on shipbuilder ASC's ability to build the next generation of submarines in Adelaide in a possible partnership with an international firm.
It's going to be very hard in Cabinet to muster support for doubling down on the Australian industry to build the next generation of submarines or warships.
The first destroyer will be put in the water tomorrow, but is still more than a year away from deployment.
At least 18 rebel fighters have been killed during an operation by Colombia's army overnight. It's one of the most deadly confrontations since the guerrillas began peace talks with the government more than 2 years ago. FARC began negotiations at the end of 2012 in a bid to halt a conflict that's killed more than 220,000 people and displaced millions in the country. Former Korean Air executive Heather Cho, who was jailed for an outburst over macadamia nuts, has been freed after winning a court appeal. Cho was jailed for a year in February, but the court has today ruled she should serve a suspended sentence. She was convicted of violating plane safety after ordering a taxiing plane back to the gate to offload a steward who had served her nuts the wrong way. The appeal court ruled she did not cause a change in the flight path. Let's take a look at the share market for you with just under an hour's left of trade today. For ordinaries is well, relatively flat, you'd have to say, at 5,664 points. The ASX 200 down, but just slightly, just 1 point lower at the moment. West Texas crude is trading at $60 a barrel and Tapis at $67.42. The Australian dollar currently buying but he says this is a fixture everyone at the Waratahs has been looking forward to for some time.
Yeah, I definitely thought Darwin was going to be a game for us for the season. I think, tomorrow's supposed to be clear. We should get a really good crowd out there, so it's going to be a really good atmosphere. I think the intensity of the game will be high as well.
In netball, the Adelaide Thunderbirds vice captain Lee Waddington is retiring at the end of the season. Waddington missed much of last season after a second knee reconstruction. In a statement, the Thunderbirds say it's one of the hardest decisions Waddington's made, and she has been thinking about it for some time. Finally to golf, and the US Masters champion Gordon Spieth is in a four-way tie for the lead after the opening round of the PGA Tour's Colonial Invitational in Texas. The American shot a 6-under par 64 to be level with fellow Americans Kevin Na and Boo Weekley and Japan's Ryo Ishikawa. Mark Leishman is the best placed Australian at 4-under. Meantime, Italy's Francesco Molinari leads the European PGA Championship in England by 2 shots at 7-under after the first round.
Thank you, Debbie Spillane. Debbie will be back with more ABC News Radio Sport in the next half hour. In the meantime, let's check the roads for you with James Engelman on the Australian Traffic Network.
Kathy, thank you. In Brisbane first, we've got a report of a smash on the M1 between Beenleigh and Gatla. Also at Strathspine, a smash at Gippy Road and Bell's Pocket Road. Another one at Narangbar on the Boundary Road off-ramp to the Bruce Highway. In Sydney, accidents on Peachtree Road and the F3 in Calgary. Also one in Karana on the Pacific Highway. Another one at Hamilton South at Stewart Avenue, and one in Pimble on the Pacific Highway Telegraph Road as well. In Melbourne, accidents on Abbots Road, Dandenong South, the Chandler Highway Q and Robinsons Road and Ravenhall. In Adelaide, 3 burst water mains on the go now. Maynolds Road, Prospect, Grand Junction Road, Jeps Cross and Main South Road, Seaford. First at the moment, accident to breakdown free. I'm James Engle with more ABC News Radio traffic in half an hour.
Thanks very much, James. Mostly sunny afternoon, 19 degrees the current temperature. Sydney, the rain is easing, although it will remain windy, 17 right now. In Canberra, a partly cloudy afternoon, 13 degrees currently. Melbourne, also 13 at the moment. Possible drizzle in Melbourne this afternoon. Hobart, partly cloudy, it's 12 degrees. Adelaide, 15, almost 16 degrees, a mostly sunny afternoon ahead. In Perth this afternoon, partly cloudy, but it should be dry, 21 the current temperature. And in Darwin, it's 33 degrees right now, a mostly sunny afternoon. ABC News Radio, where Eastern Time is 3:15. It's 2:45 in the centre. In the west, it's 1:15. Good afternoon.
ABC News Radio headlines.
Well, the Prime Minister has dismissed Indonesia's criticisms of Australia's response to the refugee crisis in Southeast Asia. Indonesia's foreign minister says it's not fair for Australia to refuse to resettle any of the thousands of asylum seekers fleeing Myanmar by boat. We'll have more from Indonesia on that in just a moment. The Child Sex Abuse Royal Commission has heard the notorious convicted paedophile Robert Best remains a Christian brother, and the order has made no attempts to remove him. The Royal Commission has been told that the Christian brothers have paid more than $1.5 million for the legal defence of Best and other convicted paedophiles, Edward Dowland and Stephen Farrell. And a skin cancer expert has today warned that 2 out of 3 Australians will be diagnosed with the disease by the time they are 70. Well, the Indonesian government has criticised Australia's refusal to accept some of the thousands of people caught up in Southeast Asia's asylum seeker crisis. Indonesia's foreign minister says Australia's actions aren't fair, and Indonesia will discuss the issue with Malaysia and
Thailand today. Well, Indonesia correspondent George Roberts has more on the reaction from Jakarta.
Well, it's been partly one of amusement and partly a reminder of Australia's obligations under the UN Refugee Convention. Yesterday, the spokesman for the Indonesian Foreign Ministry, Nasir, smiled when he was asked what he thought of Australia's refusal to help out, and then said that Australia seems to be the exception. He expects the international community to step up, and he questioned whether Australia is committed to the UN Refugee Convention, pointing out that Australia is a signatory. Today, or yesterday rather, Retno Marsudi, the Foreign Minister, also spoke to CNN and gave her views on Mr Abbott's refusal to take Rohingya refugees.
It is not fair that it is Indonesian problem, Indonesian actually problem. It's not Indonesian problem. But again, we offered a solution and clearly mentioned that we need cooperation from international community.
And George, in response to that, what are the other countries doing?
Well, Thailand, Malaysia and Indonesia are offering to take about 7,000 of the asylum seekers, refugees and economic migrants in temporarily and offer them protection. Malaysia has announced that its military, its navy, is going to go out on a rescue mission now. So turning around from the turn-back operations that it was doing previously, it's now going on a rescue mission to find some of these people. And the Malaysian and Indonesian foreign ministers have travelled to Myanmar and met with officials there and urged them to do more about it. The Indonesian Foreign Ministry says that Myanmar has committed to trying to do more efforts to stop people from fleeing the country, and also some of its officials in Jakarta here are reportedly going to travel to see some of the Rohingya refugees who've turned up in Indonesia.
Okay, George, and what happens next?
Well, next week there's another regional meeting involving more people. Earlier on this week there was a crisis meeting of sorts between Malaysia, Indonesia and Thailand where they agreed to stop the boat turnbacks, and next week there's a larger regional meeting. There are reports that Myanmar has agreed to turn up to that meeting, and Australia is to have representation there as well. We could probably expect that Australia will come under pressure from some of the other regional countries to take some of these Rohingya refugees when they have had their claims processed and be resettled, given that Indonesia has stressed that international countries need to step up and do their part as well.
Our Indonesia correspondent George Roberts there speaking to Kumi Taguchi.
This is ABC News Radio. News as it develops.
A global study warns the gap between rich and poor is widening at a dramatic pace. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, says the world's richest 10% earns nearly 10 times more than the poorest 10%. While the report shows Australia scores well for income equality, welfare groups say that's not necessarily the reality in the nation's disadvantaged households. Peter Ryan reports.
The world might be recovering from the global financial crisis, but the OECD says it's not necessarily a better place for workers. There's been a shift to what it calls non-standard work, which now accounts for more than half of all job creation, with a surge in self-employment and more temporary and part-time roles created over the past 2 decades. More workers have insecure jobs which tend to be of lower quality, and the pay packet is more often than not lighter. The OECD says that's widened the gap between rich and poor dramatically since the 1980s. It's an alarming wake-up call, according to the OECD's Secretary General, Angel Gurria.
The latest data that appears here, they make rather stark reading. The richest 10% of the population now earn 9.6 times the income of the poorest 10%. So what? Well, the problem is, every 10 years, the times that the income of the poorest goes and the income of the richest grows by 1 time more.
Angel Gurria says the bottom 40% of workers now hold just 3% of total household wealth, and there's evidence that workers trapped in the middle are hurting more than ever.
What matters for growth is not just that the poorest ethics, nothing about morality, of which this is an enormous story. Just the financial, the economic impact of the phenomenon, and the fact that it is breeding its own blockage for further growth.
Australia ranks highly in the OECD's report as one of the world's wealthiest developed nations, with its best paid workers earning 8.8 times more than its worst paid, below the OECD average. That's been helped by tax cuts since 2007 and rising property prices, meaning income distribution appears to be more equal. But that's not the story in real-world Australia. Adam Mooney, Chief Executive of Good Shepherd Microfinance, sees daily and hourly evidence that the wealth gap is widening.
Well, it's certainly going in the wrong direction, Peter. We know that there are 2.5 million people in Australia that are living below the poverty line, and that number's increasing. From our work at Good Shepherd Microfinance, there's no surprise. There's a high correlation between the poverty, those that are excluded from mainstream services, and also those that can't get access to fair, safe and inclusive financial services as well. So there are 3 million people that are financially excluded today.
With that widening gap between rich and poor and more casualisation of the workforce, you find that even for people who are in work, what they're being paid is not enough to make ends meet at home.
That's right. Well, what we're finding is pressure through companies to find efficiencies, to restrict the number of hours that people are working during the day to suit the company is absolutely hitting the family's hip pockets, and we're seeing more and more people presenting
in the capital. The police seem determined to stop them, and did. The women are against President Pierre Nkurunziza's bid for a third term.
We need peace and we want to be heard. Why are you beating us? What have we done? We don't want people to die because of the selfishness of our leaders.
The police eventually leave. Defeated, the women are too distraught to protest. The police have shown they mean business. The capital hasn't been peaceful for weeks. On Thursday, police and members of the Presidential Guard dispersed people trying to march to Parliament, where the President was swearing in new ministers. At least one person was killed. People here say they are tired of the violence and death. They are begging the international community to intervene.
This person has just been killed in front of us. President Obama, the rest of the world needs to rise up and be seen. They need to stop this man.
There is a heavy security presence in some parts of Bujumbura. Many people say they don't feel safe. A man was shot and killed in this neighborhood. After that happened, protesters got scared and they ran away. They're saying it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to come onto the street. Government officials say nearly 200 people have been arrested since the protests against President Nkurunziza began nearly a month ago. Many have also been injured or killed. Despite this, defiant Burundians say they won't stop until the president gives up plans to hang on to power.
And that report from Al Jazeera's Haru Mutasa in the capital of Burundi, Bujumbura. Well, the knowledge that an international cricket match is now being held on home soil for the first time in 6 years is big news in Pakistan. And the team they have to thank for ending the drought is Zimbabwe. They're the first foreign team to venture to the country since the 2009 attack by militants in Lahore, which left a driver and 6 policemen dead and
my name's Wilfred West from Loch, Victoria, Australia, signing off. Thank you for watching my videos, and on commentator, welcome. It's about 29 past 3 in the evening. So that wasn't a bad little drive, was it? Well, I do hope you like this video, and if so, please subscribe. You all have a great day now.